In this slideshow, we are going to be looking at assumptions and risk assessment. First, we're going to define what is an assumption. The final column of your log frame is called assumptions. An assumption describes situations, events, conditions or decisions which are necessary for project success, but are mainly or completely beyond the control of the project management. Therefore, you're assuming something will happen. That is why it's called an assumption. Let's think about assumptions. You have a project which is seeking to increase the number of teachers working in rural areas. You've decided that an output is to increase the number of primary school teachers enrolled in college. What are the assumptions? I can see two assumptions. One is that there's a pool of young people wanting, eligible to be teachers, and that once trained, young teachers will want and be willing to go and work in rural areas. Where does the risk and assumption link in? A risk is a factor, internal or external, that could adversely affect the outcome of any intervention. And there are low or high risk. Often the high risks are called killer risks. So now let's look at our assumption and what risk do they present. So you can see this link between an assumption and then whether is it a risk or not. So we said that there's a pool, our assumption was there's a pool of young people wanting and eligible to be teachers. How do you assess that as a risk? I think it's probably generally low risk, as there's a large young population in developing countries. Whether they have the education level would depend a little bit on your country as to whether that is a low or medium risk. Our next assumption was that once trained, young teachers will want to work in rural areas. Now here I think we'd all agree that is a high risk, because often once teachers are in urban areas, they're very unwilling to go back and work in rural areas. And I think we're talking here about a killer risk to achieving your output, which was ultimately about getting teachers to work in rural areas. So the next step in all this is a risk assessment. And it's a critical element of developing your realistic log frame. And as I said, it's the end column. So what this does, it looks at the probability and significance of the assumptions, external conditions being met. What is the risk that the assumption you have made will not be met? Then it assesses whether there are any other risks not covered by the assumption. So you do your assumptions first, and then you have to think about some things that are not actual internal assumptions to your project, but external, such as political violence, natural disasters. So you have internal to the project, and then you look at external things that could affect your programme that are not mentioned in your assumption list. So how do we do this? We have a matrix with two columns, a probability column, low, medium and high, and an impact column, low, medium and high. And so we assess where our assumptions fit within this matrix. I will now go along to show you how this works. You look at each of your own assumptions as a risk and assess the probability of the risk factor occurring. Is it high, medium and low? Then you assess the impact of the event. If the event happened, would the impact be low? And put that into the matrix which I showed you in the last slide. And then you assess the overall risk of the project. Going back to our example, we said that the risk that newly trained teachers will not wish to work in rural areas is high. So what is the probability? We have to ask, what is the probability that will happen? So the probability is probably medium that this will happen, that many teachers will not wish to go. Probability is not wish to go to work in the rural areas. Then we have to look at the impact on the project if teachers will not work in these areas. And I think that is a high impact. That is, it will have a huge effect on the output of your project. It will seriously affect whether you achieve it or not. So therefore, we put this in the matrix as a medium probability, high risk. See the next. So we now place our assumption as into the risk matrix. So we agreed that teachers working in rural areas of medium probability, it's here, goes into this column here. Its impact was high. And now we do this for our others. So example, if we said there was a low probability that there would be insufficient financing in the programme, we put it here, and then we look at the impact of that, and we said that would be high, we'd put it up here. So it's low probability, high impact. And as you start to put together the assumptions as risks, you start to define whether your project is a high. So as I said, you do this for all your assumptions and assess what is the final risk assessment, what is the final risk for your project. Let's say it's high. If it's high, you then have to ask yourself, will the project be successful or is it just going to fail? Because that's what a donor is going to ask you if you have a very high risk. Some donors are averse to risk, some are not. Next step is to think about risk mitigation strategies. So you look at your assumptions and ask yourself, what strategies can be then implemented to reduce the risk or reduce its impact? Using our example again, what could be done to encourage trained teachers to work in rural areas? Well, we know financial incentives might help. We know there are some soft incentives, such as additional training opportunities. However, if you decide that you need to do these as a risk mitigation strategy, they'll need to be added as project activities, as they'll need a budget. And it's more than likely you'll need to revise your log frame to reflect this. Once you've revised your log frame, you'll then need to look at your risk assessment again, because by implementing a risk mitigation strategy, you have hopefully reduced the risk from high to medium. And so you need to review your risk mitigation strategy and amend it to reflect the changes that have been made. In summary, risk is the final step in developing the log frame. But it is critical to assess risk realistically and where possible find ways to minimise risk. There's no point running away from the risks that face your project, because ultimately it will catch you out in the first annual review. And at that time it may not be possible to make the necessary changes. Many risks cannot be mitigated against, but many can be. And seeking ways to do this early is the key to the success of your project.